The Goldwater phenomenon unquestionably was the turning point in the post-war history of American conservative politics. He really did come out of nowhere. He was elected in 1952 out of Arizona. No one had heard of him before. And for the next basically 7 years, no one heard of him again. He was not a major player in the Senate, nor would he have been expected to be a major player because he was a new senator. He came from Arizona, and at that point, Arizona was on the far edge of politics. It wasn't a state as powerful as California. It was the state next to California, which was basically ignored. So he was not a famous figure. He did have a reputation in Washington as being in favor of a strong defense, and generally he would not vote for a lot of boondoggles, but that didn't make him famous. In 1960, when his book, The Conscience of a Conservative, was published and became a bestseller very rapidly, it took, I think, everyone by surprise, including Goldwater. It was a well-written book. Whether he actually wrote it or not has always been a question. Certainly, it is a well-developed book, gets the ideas across in a relatively short time frame. You can sit, read that book in a few hours, and you've got the basic idea. It was an effective political tract. And he came at the right time in this sense, that is, Eisenhower was about to leave, and Kennedy was the new hotshot on the block, very charismatic figure, very attractive wife, probably the best-looking couple in political history, at the top of the heap. Presidents normally are not young and pretty good-looking, and they don't have beautiful wives, so they were a unique couple. In that respect, though, we've got to understand that while they were photogenic, and while there's no doubt that Kennedy gave a good speech, he was a quick learner, he read enormously fast, he had a very good memory, he was great at a press conference. So he was an effective man in front of a camera in a way that Nixon wasn't, and certainly in a way that Eisenhower wasn't. So from the media standpoint, Kennedy was extremely effective. But at the same time, the content of his policies was relatively weak. There was nothing particularly significant about what he did in terms of domestic policies. He wasn't making himself famous as a liberal. He wasn't getting through a lot of legislation. He was mainly photogenic. With the series of crises, first the disaster of the invasion of Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, disaster of '61, then followed shortly by the Berlin Wall going up. The best thing he did, for which he should be given enormous credit, he couldn't take any credit for, and that was avoiding nuclear war in October of '62. And that crisis came perilously close to war, as far as we can tell in retrospect, the famous 13 days. And that was over the issue of the Cuban missiles. Of course, they weren't Cuban missiles, they were Soviet missiles on Cuban soil. And Kennedy's administration had denied that there were any such missiles. It wasn't Kennedy who found those missiles or admitted those missiles. It was Kenneth Keating, a senator from New York. And Keating was the first political figure to warn against missiles being put on ships and being transported into Cuban soil. And it was denied. The president denied it, the administration denied it, and then finally they couldn't deny it. And so once it became public knowledge, or was about to become public knowledge, then there was a crisis, because more of those missiles were going to be put on board ships. They were almost operational. And then he had to do something. And they did get through that crisis, and it could have gone the wrong way, and we would not be here talking about it. But he could not take credit for that politically, because if he talked about just how close to nuclear war the country had come, it might have seriously frightened the country. So he wasn't able to take credit for it. And also there was a deal that was cut where they would pull missiles out of Turkey, but only a few months later, after the crisis had blown over, and that neither side would take credit or explain why those missiles were being removed. So he could not go public about his greatest success. So by 1962 and into 63, he was looking vulnerable. And then there was this tiny problem. It looked tiny at the time. In the biblical language, a cloud no bigger than a man's hand. And that was South Vietnam. And he began to send advisors into South Vietnam, and it was clear that that was going to escalate, and he was caught in what did become the quagmire. And he was not taking clear-cut stand on what to do about it, what policy ought to be. And so that was beginning to be a problem for him in terms of foreign policy. So in the summer of 1963, he looked at least potentially vulnerable politically for the 64 election. And a group of outsiders, Republican Party conservative outsiders, began encouraging Goldwater to make a run for the presidency. And Goldwater was hesitant at first, and then as he got a little more excited about it, he decided that he would make an attempt because he believed that it was at least possible that the Republican Party could be effective, could knock Kennedy off out of that position politically in 1964. He really did look vulnerable. This whole Camelot imagery was invented by Jackie Kennedy after the assassination. She was a much more skilled person with the media than anybody suspected. And that is basically her legacy to the country, that whole mythology of Camelot. He was not the fair-haired boy by 1963, mid-63. He was possibly facing a defeat. Then came the assassination, and that permanently changed America. You can really say that that was a turning point. And it was a turning point in many respects. Culturally, it became one. Psychologically, it became one, because here was a man who seemed to be young and vigorous and articulate, what we might call a man of the can-do liberalism persuasion, a man of the people. Here was a man shot down in full public view. There was nothing that could have been done. The president is vulnerable. But it was a reminder that nobody is safe, that the system carries on, but nobody really ultimately is safe. And he was a symbol of prosperity, a symbol of can-do liberalism, and all of a sudden he's gunned down. And that was a shock to the country. And people from my generation and older and even younger ones can tell you where they were when they first were told of Kennedy's, wasn't clear it was an assassination, but that he'd been gunned down, that he was in a hospital, that he'd been targeted, somebody attempted to kill him. An entire generation, millions of Americans can tell you where they were when they first heard that news. So it was a shock to the country. Johnson came in, immediately began consolidating power, pushing civil rights legislation, which had never been done before, certainly not been done under Kennedy, who stayed as far away from that issue as he could. Johnson was a doer, a pusher. He'd been the senior man in the Senate Majority Leader. He was a master of power. He was a man who could blackmail anybody who had ever made a mistake. He had the goods on everybody, and he got what he wanted. And in the aftermath of the assassination, he wanted a whole lot. Goldwater was not convinced that he could beat Johnson. He really did not want to run in '64. But he had made commitments, and so he got support. And because of that, a groundswell of opinion began to back him, which was completely unexpected. There was no reason to believe in 1963 that there would be a groundswell of public opinion favoring his candidacy. And all of a sudden, without warning, he is winning primaries. He is being successful. And he got to the convention and was victorious, and the Eastern Republican establishment lost. And that was the only time that the Eastern Republican establishment lost in the 20th century. They were never again caught flat-footed. They were not prepared. They resented Goldwater and his policies. He resented them. There was great animosity between Goldwater's faction of the party, which was a true grassroots faction, versus the Eastern Republican establishment. And the incarnation of that establishment was Nelson Rockefeller. And Rockefeller was governor of New York, powerful figure, of course, man of enormous wealth, famous name, liberal to the core, openly liberal to the core, had no use for Goldwater and the conservatives, and so the Eastern Republican establishment did not finance the campaign. It had to be done by grassroots contributions. They sabotaged him, and I think they did it self-consciously. They did not want him to win. They were far more ready to see Lyndon Johnson win in 1964 than have Goldwater win. They wanted to get him out of the party and make certain that the conservatives within the party never had that opportunity again. So he was sandbagged from both sides. He was conservative. He was perceived as a warmonger because he favored national defense. And at that point, Johnson had not escalated the war in Vietnam, so he got away with it, with being the candidate of peace. And it was clear that he was going to win. But as part of that campaign, the conservatives for the first time got a taste of just how much influence they could have. And that is because they didn't know before then that there were as many of them as there in fact were. And one of the ways that they found out was through 3 paperback books. You can't think of cheap paperback books as making a difference, but they did make a difference. There were 3 of them. One of them was called A Choice, Not an Echo, by a young woman, a very articulate woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly. And she was telling the truth about the Republican Party and about the political process. And she said, we have had an echo in the Republican Party for the whole 20th century. There's never been a choice, and now there is a choice. And in fact, there was a choice. Goldwater was from outside the system. He had not been vetted by any of the establishment institutions. So there was a choice available, and she tried to get that story across to the conservative faithful. There was a second book called None Dare Call It Treason by John Stormer, which was a story of compromises with communism, liberalism, through the Republican and Democratic political process that had been going on for years. And he, of course, he really believed it was a kind of treason, but he said no one will call it that, so that's why he titled the book None Dare Call It Treason. And it sold by the millions. And the third one was by J. Evetts Haley, called A Texan Looks at Lyndon. Now, nobody had heard of Haley, really Haley, I guess you'd pronounce it, Evetts Haley. But Haley had a good reputation as a first-rate historian of the West. He was an expert in Texas history. And his children had heard him talk about how corrupt Johnson was, and finally they pushed him. They said, look, who's going to tell that story? If you don't tell the story, who's going to tell it? And he realized nobody would, so he wrote the book. These three books sold by the millions. They were bought in bulk and sent around and given away, and they developed mailing lists as a result of it, and it was clear that some major phenomenon had taken place, that books that never would have gotten a hearing, this kind of a hearing, even to just 10,000 people, were getting a hearing by millions of people. And that was a turning point. It really was a turning point. Now, towards the end of the campaign, it was pretty clear to everybody that Goldwater was not going to win. And at that point, some of his supporters out in the West Coast said, there's an opportunity here. Ronald Reagan, who was at that point 10 years out of Hollywood, Ronald Reagan has been giving a speech in favor of Goldwater. And we'd like to film it, and we'll pay to put it on television. And the guys back in Washington were kind of hostile to the idea. But Goldwater saw the film and said, I like it. Let's do it. And so independent funding got that film showed across America. Well, it was one of the great speeches, political speeches ever given, especially by a man who wasn't running. Maybe the greatest political speech of, at the time, a non-politician that ever has been given in American history, or at least since the time of "Give me liberty or give me death" in 1770. A powerful speech, and it galvanized support that anybody that articulate could make the case for conservatism as well as Reagan did. And you can find it on YouTube. You can hear that speech, read that speech. Very, very effective. It didn't save the Goldwater campaign, but it made Reagan's reputation. And Reagan had been a liberal, a real hardcore liberal, as recently as probably 1951, 52, that period. He was an anti-communist. He'd been head of the Screen Actors Guild, and he was an anti-communist, no doubt about that. And they hated him. Communists hated him. And he was trying to keep communists from taking over the Screen Actors Guild and get him out of Hollywood. So he was hated. He was given death threats and so forth. But he was a member of the United World Federalists. He was an old supporter of the New Deal. So there's no way that he was a conservative. But what happened was, when his career faded, he got hired by General Electric, and specifically by an unknown man today and even then, but a truly great man named Lemuel Boulware. And Lem Boulware was the man in charge of General Electric's public relations. And he was able, for years, to challenge the liberalization pushed by the union. He had good working relationships with members of the union. He brought in Reagan at a very high salary. For those days, an enormous salary. I think like $125,000 a year, which in 1952 or 53, that's equivalent today of close to $1 million a year. And he put him on what we like to call the rubber chicken circuit. Put him out to talk with the members of General Electric, the people actually doing the work. He'd go out and he'd give the speech on business and free enterprise. And Boulware was a real conservative, real free market man. And over a period of time, Reagan began to believe his own speeches. And he got very good at giving a speech. Of course, he was always good. He was an actor, and he was and a first-rate communicator. But he got really good. And he was on the General Electric Theater. He introduced the stories every week that they would have. So he became nationally known, not simply as an actor, but as a spokesman. And by 1964, he really was a conservative. As much as anybody out of Hollywood was going to be a conservative, he was. Boulware had convinced him, and his own speeches had convinced him. And in doing the research to write the speeches, he had converted over. And so there was no doubt that that was, from his point of view, the decisive moment. Was giving that speech and having it shown around the country on the various television stations. Now, after Goldwater's defeat, which was overwhelming, he was smashed, except for the South. And the South voted for him, and that was the break. The Civil Rights Act that Lyndon Johnson had passed in '64, Johnson knew what would happen. He said, we will lose the Democratic South forever. And he was right. They never got it back. They voted for Goldwater in '64, and they never again consistently voted for a Democrat. And Johnson counted that as part of the cost of getting the civil rights legislation passed. At that point, one man had a vision, a true entrepreneurial vision. His name was Richard Viguerie. And Richard had an idea. He knew that contributions above $50 had to be recorded by law, and that those names and addresses had to be turned over, and they were turned over to the House of Representatives. And so he got an idea. Why not go down there and get those names and addresses and write them down and get a mailing list out of them? And so there were about 12 to 13,000 names. He went down. He began by hand writing them. He realized, I can't do this. There are too many names. He hired some secretaries. And before he gotten them quite all recorded, he was told by some bureaucrat in the House, well, he didn't have the right to get those names. Of course, he did, but he backed off. But on the basis of something in the range of 10 to 11,000 names, he compiled the first right-wing conservative mailing list. And on the basis of that, began to mail for political candidates. And that became an empire. That mailing list became the basis of many victories, many conservative victories. Jesse Helms, most famous, but there were others in the House. There's no question that Viguerie's mailing list was a turning point for the conservative movement. You want to ask media, what's the media? What are the media? Well, the mailing list was a major part of it, and Viguerie had it. So at that point, you now had, though you had a defeat, you had a mailing list developed, you had mobilization of conservatives. They knew there were millions of others. You had the penetration of the three famous books. You had really a conservative movement now beginning to move. And so at that point, I think by, say, 1965, you now have the foundation of what we call the modern conservative movement. It had taken 20 years to do this. There was almost nothing, literally nothing, in 1944. Just the barest glimmer of a reaction in 1945. And slowly, the conservative forces began to build. The mailing lists, a few tiny mailing lists began to be compiled. You had a libertarian side of it with the Freeman and the Foundation for Economic Education. You had anti-communism, of course, with certainly with McCarthy and those who were associated with McCarthy. You had kind of a fusion of the two at the National Review under Bill Buckley. So you had at least a way to communicate your ideas out to the faithful few. Now, the mailing lists were not huge. They weren't like 200,000. They were more like 15,000, 20,000. Then with the Goldwater campaign, it may be 30, 35,000. There was growth, but there wasn't a great deal. And then came Goldwater, then came Viguerie's mailing list, and then there was a potential. The second phase of this, which I would really date from 1965 onward, there were a number of strands that took place, but in terms of what was to take place, certainly by the 1980 period, there was a change of opinion in what had been very leftist circles in New York City. And those circles were generally Jewish, but they weren't Jewish. They were agnostic, liberal Judaism, which was not Judaism in the eyes of the Orthodox Jews. But they were Jewish by culture. They'd been leftists. Some of them been Stalinists. Some of them had been Trotskyites. They'd been on the far left for a long time. And they had a kind of an epiphany. One of them was named Norman Podhoretz, another was named Irving Kristol, and they began to change. And they began to see that the Soviet Union really was a terrible threat. They began to see that the welfare state was not producing effectively as they had hoped. They began to rethink their commitment to the old far left liberalism, the far left end of the Democratic Party. And Podhoretz was the editor at Commentary magazine, which was very influential. And at that point, Crystal, with financial support, began what was called The Public Interest, a quarterly magazine, scholarly, semi-scholarly magazine of ideas. And they began to rethink in public view much of the welfare state, and they began to rethink any thought that there could be an accommodation with the Soviet Union. And that brought money into the conservative movement, or would over the next 20 years, and it certainly brought intellectual talent, because these men had been associated with highly educated people, professors around the country, and bit by bit you began to see that within the old liberal community there had also been rethinking, and a lot of people who didn't know that there were others like them out there began to write for Commentary, began to write for the Public Interest, and lo and behold, they found that there were other intellectuals who were also beginning to rethink much of the New Deal, or at least the New Deal as of 1965, the extension of the New Deal. So they had the same kind of epiphany that the people out in the Republican hinterlands had experienced with Goldwater. That is, hey, there are a lot of us out here. So did intellectual, formerly leftist, probably atheist, sometimes Jewish academicians find that they were not entirely alone as they began to rethink some of the foundations of American political life. In that same year, out in California, an unknown fellow named R.J. Rushdoony started an organization called the Chalcedon Foundation, and that organization began to publish a newsletter, a very small circulation newsletter, and that newsletter began to gain some support, and his idea was to use Christianity to rethink some of the fundamentals of Christian orthodoxy, to show that it did apply to society, it did apply to politics and economics. In the phrase which is common today, he was pushing a Christian worldview, and he was one of the few at the time to do this. And he had a great deal of scholarship on his side. He'd been studying very intensely for 25 years. He was an amazing reader. He would read 200 books a year. He would write chapters, sometimes 13, 15, 20 chapters of finished scholarly material. He would preach 150 times a year. He turned out a lot of material and would continue to do so. So from the end of the country, at the other end of the country, from New York, you began to see, again, a rethinking of the foundations of the American Republic, only this time from an explicitly Christian point of view. So by 65, you could see the change in the conservative movement, and at the same time you began to see on the other side the rise of the counterculture, and you can date that too. And the dating of that was the arrival of the Beatles in February of '64, about 10 weeks after the death of Kennedy. And they swept the country. They became an international phenomenon, but certainly they became an American phenomenon. And they were followed rapidly by what was called the British invasion. You began to see these rock groups coming over. They grabbed the minds of teenage Americans. They began to make an awful lot of money, and the people who produced their records made an awful lot of money. And then at this time, as this change was taking place, this sense of liberation, this sense of transformation tied to the music, you began to see again, bit by bit and very slowly, you began to see the beginning of the counterculture, where there was a move to kind of a New Age religion. By 65 or 66, marijuana was beginning to be used as a means of personal transformation and of religious insight and religious experience. You began to see, even on the very far fringes, the use of LSD. The counterculture was about to hit. And with that change of youth, the so-called youth revolution of the 60s, which was really only the youth revolution of the last 5 years of the 60s, you began to see then a kind of a division culturally in the United States, and that was again to reinforce the direction of the conservative movement. And we'll be talking about that in the next section.